Nels. I love New English Library. They were formed in 1961 when an American company called Times Mirror took over Ace Books and Foursquare Books, creating the New English Library. And it would go on to become, I think it's safe to say, a cult publisher. So what makes New English Library so special? First off, entertainment. The books that they published that weren't reprints, they were thin, physically thin. They were short, so you could get through them in a couple of nights. It wasn't like you were wading into War and Peace. They were lurid. They were pulps. They were modern day pulps. They had very striking covers, either brilliant photo covers, or absolutely beautiful illustrated covers. As I've said before on my videos, the cover was the hook. Well, the cover was the bait. Make you pick it up off the shelf. Immediately you'd turn it over and read the blurb, and that's what would make you shell out your cash. And this is going back. This harkens back to a time when, I don't want to say when more people read, but if you think about, the late 60s, early 70s, when New English Library really, they had their boom and were very successful, there wasn't a lot of TV channels. There were 2, 3 channels that went off at 11 o'clock at night. My first introduction to them was seeing them on the kitchen table when I was little, because my dad would have one in his work jacket pocket when he was on night shift. And at quiet times he'd read his book. I remember my granddad always having a kind of trashy Western novel on the go, because when the snooker wasn't on, he wasn't interested in telly. Now, a lot of these books were written, a lot of the ones I'm going to talk about were written kind of 40, 45 years ago. So, political, sexual, moral attitudes were often quite different then. This is also a time capsule from looking at it from modern eyes, it's a time capsule to a different world. I think New English Library are probably best remembered culturally for their skinhead and biker novels that came from the early 70s, written by Jim Moffat under the pseudonym of Richard Allen. I personally struggle a little bit with the skinhead books. They're not my favourites. They're harsh and ugly. There's rough prose, and there's even rougher sex and violence. One thing I dislike a little bit is the inherent racism, but if you're writing books about skinheads in 1970, that is an aspect that you can't kind of ignore. The biker books that were written by a few different authors, yes, the levels of sex and violence are quite staggering at times. You don't want anybody reading these books over your shoulder, because they're going to wonder what the heck you're reading. But they were equally popular. And this is something that New English Library did. They tapped into almost like youth culture before youth culture existed as a thing. A lot of the most collectible books now reflect this. And whenever a youth movement came along, they'd try and churn out some flimsy paperback about that, just to get the sales. in an interview with Lawrence James, who was a in-house writer and publishing editor for New English Library, he does talk a little bit about Jim Moffat. Largely about, because a lot of people thought that they were genuinely written by a young man that was a skinhead, embroiled in this world of violence, racism, and sex. And Lawrence James goes on to say, the research he did for the skinhead books was like 2 hours in one pub talking to half a dozen skinheads. He hated skinheads. He hated kids. He was not a youth-orientated man. Jim really wasn't. I can't remember now who had the idea for the Skinhead series. It may have been Peter Haining. It may have been mine. It may have been Jim himself. But the first Skinhead book came out and sold extremely well. I can't remember how it actually did come up, where it came from. I can't remember the catalyst for the Skinhead books, but Jim started doing them, and he was a terrible old man. He was unreliable, extremely right-wing, a terrible drunk, a liar. He hated kids. What more can I tell you about Jim Moffat? So, yeah. Lawrence James goes on to say, he began to believe that he was in touch with youth culture. And youth culture to him was fascist skinheads. He started putting masses of terrible racism in his books. His manuscripts were just completely racist. And I was labouring away trying to get rid of all this from his prose and saying, Jim, sorry, you can't keep kicking the heads of Asians. No, sorry, Jim. And in the end, after Skinhead Girls, I actually refused to deal with him anymore because of his drink problem. In the same interview with Lawrence James, he goes on to talk about the biker series, because he did write some of those as well. And he's asked if he had a lot of knowledge of the biker Hells Angel lifestyle. Absolutely none at all. I mean, what really started the motorcycle thing was Hunter S. Thompson's Hells Angels books. It was very successful. Then at New English Library we published Jim Moffat's Skinhead books, which were very successful. So we looked for another area of youth culture, and the motorcycle gangs were an obvious area for that. And I think Peter Cave did the first ones, and also a guy called Stuart Gordon, who wrote some bike books under the name Alex R. Stewart. Lawrence James did write some of the Hells Angels books, whilst he was a commissioned editor at at New English Library. In the same interview, he says, I'd take guys out to lunch and give them ideas for books, and they'd go and write them, and they'd make £150, £200 out of these books. And I thought, I could do that. And so I wrote the first Angels book and sent it through a friend anonymously to the other editor. So I never actually touched it. Nell bought it, and after that I did 3 more. They all did well. They sold about 70,000 copies, which was good sales even then. New English Library continued to keep a similar format. There'd be series, they'd tap into what was popular at the time. They did publish a lot of crime, although they had authors like Dorothy L. Sayers that they published. They did a lot of more violent crime novels that focused on either mad killers or crooked police officers. As spaghetti westerns became popular, they had long series of Wild West books that weren't like Bonanza and High Chaparral. These were gritty and violent, keeping that lurid thrill going in whatever genre they published in. Even odd things like when the TV series Roots was popular, they did a series of almost like blaxploitation novels where the main protagonist would be a slave that rebelled against the slave owner, kind of thing, keeping that theme going. But obviously I want to look at their horror output. New English Library published so much stuff, a lot of science fiction. They've got a huge science fiction back catalogue. Me personally, I'm not a massive fan of sci-fi novels, so maybe that's a video for someone else to do. What got me into New English Library was their horror output. They kept the same format for some things. They did series, so you've got the Errol Locale specialist series that was Wilfred McNeely, who also wrote under the pseudonym Peter Saxon. I'm going to do a whole other video about Peter Saxon at some point. There was the Don Gluck Frankenstein series. There was the Robert Lorry Dracula series. They even took old pulp characters like the Spider, reprinted those, but tweaked some of the cultural references to make them relevant to the 70s. And they even came up with their own horror series that's weirdly unlinked and randomly numbered, that was just horror books that they published that they put into a series. New English Library really upped the ante with horror, and the illustrated covers and photo covers are just some of my favourite book covers in the world ever. This reflects their desire to just tap into what was popular, as there was a horror boom in cinema. New English Library upped their horror output. It wasn't authors that people maybe weren't as aware of. New English Library jumped on. I mean, they'd published Harold Robbins' novels in the 70s. They were hugely popular. And in terms of horror, they jumped on Stephen King, James Herbert, Guy Smith, authors that did sell a lot by volume. They carried the horror output through the 80s and 90s. And then they drop in some classic horror, some reprints and things. They did horror movie tie-ins. They tend to pick quite interesting and odd genre movies or cult movies. This staggering output of genre books was really down to two people, Lawrence James and Mark Howell. And in the interview that I've been reading from, Lawrence James is asked how many books were published in a year. Probably something like 60 or 70 hardbacks and 150 to 200 paperbacks. And there were only two of us. We had a good time at Nell. We were doing all the commissioning. We were doing all the contracting. We were writing all the blurbs, doing any editing. Proofreading, that went on as well. It was good, an astronomical amount of work. At the time, because there were only two of us, we would have to do as many as 20 or 25 blurbs a month. You were supposed to spread them out over the month, and in fact, you had the big production meeting on the last Friday of every month. So normally, on the last Thursday of every month, after lunch, Mark and I would do all the blurbs, which would be about 25 blurbs between us. We'd pass them backwards and forwards to come up with minimalist copy, which would say things like, 2 men, a town, the gold, they'd come together at Rainbow's End. And that would be it. Although Nell did stick to quite formulaic publishing, they did drop things in that you weren't always expecting. In 1971, they reprinted a Spanish horror comic magazine called Dracula, which I am going to do another video about because I think it needs a video on its own. They also published a biography of Mary Whitehouse, which is a very odd decision. For those of you who don't know who Mary Whitehouse was, she was a very outspoken critic of any kind of violence in the media, films, TV, everything like that, who a lot of people think took things to an extreme. She was like the moral majority in America kind of thing. So it's kind of odd that Lawrence James should want to publish a book by and about her. In the interview, he goes on to say, "My idea originally had been to do a biography of Mary Whitehouse because I thought it would be really interesting to see what the lady was really about. I thought I'd write to her first and ask if she wanted to do an autobiography, and when she said no, I'd then go ahead and get a journalist to do a biography. To my amazement, Mary Whitehouse agreed to do an autobiography. She was very enthusiastic, very nice lady. I think a lot of her ideas are incredibly extreme, but she is inherently a decent person. James also mentions Mary Whitehouse when talking about authors making a decent living from New English Library. In the end, even the authors made some money out of it. They earned royalties. Even Mary Whitehouse made money. Mary Whitehouse's great skill was she give talks, and authors, as you know, are allowed to buy copies at trade. Most authors now and again might buy about 3 copies of one of their books to give to relatives or whatever. But Mary Whitehouse used to send for about 1,200 copies of her books at trade price, and then she'd sell them at her talks and lectures. She did very well out of it. New English Library carried on to publish horror throughout the 1980s and into the 90s, sticking with gruesome graphic horror and thrillers, keeping that line going, publishing some, what I think are some really important British horror authors of that period. It was finally laid to rest in 2004 when the bottom had well and truly dropped out of the horror market and Hodder weren't prepared to keep these things going. It's an interesting aspect of British publishing that is very much of its time. The subject matter and prose is of its time. Churning out ongoing pulp sagas is of its time. The graphic style of how the books are presented is of its time. Obviously, I haven't covered every New English Library paperback book in this video. Their output was so huge. A video that covers all of them would be hours long. And I apologise if your favourites aren't in here. I've tried to put a lot of my favourites in, give you a flavour of what appeals to me about them. So if you've enjoyed this video, thank you so much for watching. If you can, give us a like or subscribe to my channel or leave a comment. It does make a massive difference. It's a little thing you can do to help me and my fledgling channel. The more interaction you give me, the more likely YouTube is to suggest my videos to other people who are also interested in expensive ephemeral nonsense. So thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video.